The question hit Rachel Davis like a sledgehammer to the chest. Standing at the Family Feud podium in her simple black dress, the same one she'd worn to her son's funeral 8 months ago, she felt the weight of every sleepless night since that terrible morning when she'd found him unconscious on his bedroom floor. The studio lights felt too bright, too exposing, like they might reveal the guilt she carried in every cell of her body. "What's your biggest regret?" Steve Harvey had asked, and those 4 words ripped open a wound that had never stopped bleeding. It was Thursday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The Davis family had driven 6 hours from Birmingham, Alabama in Rachel's beat-up Honda Civic. The car still smelled faintly of the air freshener Tyler had hung from the rearview mirror, the one shaped like a basketball that she couldn't bring herself to remove. Every mile of that drive had been torture, every song on the radio, a reminder of the 16-year-old boy who would never sing along again. Rachel Davis, 35, looked like a woman who had aged a decade in 8 months. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. Those were the eyes of someone who had watched their child die and lived with the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, she could have prevented it. The Davis family was small but determined. Rachel's sister Jennifer, 38, had been the one to suggest applying for Family Feud. "You need to get out of that house," she'd said during one of their kitchen table conversations, about grief and guilt, and the impossible task of living after losing a child. Jennifer's husband Mark was quiet and supportive, understanding that some pain goes too deep for words. Their teenage daughter Chloe, Tyler's cousin and best friend, had insisted on coming because Tyler would have wanted to be on TV. What the audience didn't know, what the cameras couldn't capture, was that Rachel had been replaying the same 24 hours for 8 months. April 15th had started like any other Tuesday. Tyler had seemed fine at breakfast, maybe a little quiet, but teenage boys were often quiet. She'd kissed him goodbye as he left for school, told him to have a good day, reminded him about his curfew. Normal mom things, the last normal things she'd ever say to her son. During family introductions, Steve had been gentle with Rachel, sensing something fragile in her demeanor. There was a careful quality to the way she spoke, like someone walking on ice that might crack at any moment. "Rachel," Steve had said during the opening segment, "tell me about your family. You seem like close people." "We are," Rachel had replied, her voice steady but quiet. "Family is everything to us. My son Tyler always said that family comes first, no matter what." Steve had caught the past tense immediately, the way grief sneaks into conversation like an uninvited guest. "Tyler sounds like a smart young man. How old is he?" Rachel's composure had flickered for just a moment, like a candle flame in a sudden breeze. "He was 16, she'd said. And the word was hung in the studio air like a bell that had been struck. "He passed away 8 months ago." The studio had grown noticeably quieter, the audience's instinctive respect for loss creating a pocket of reverence around Rachel's words. Steve, who had learned over decades of hosting to read the geography of pain written in people's faces, had seen something in Rachel's eyes that went beyond ordinary grief. This was the look of someone carrying guilt so heavy it threatened to crush them. The game had progressed through 4 rounds with the Davis family holding their own against the Martinez family from Phoenix. But Rachel's participation had felt mechanical, like someone going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Jennifer and Mark had carried most of the load, their answers quick and supportive, while Rachel had contributed when necessary, but seemed to be operating from some distant place where nothing quite felt real. Tyler had been dead for 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. Not that Rachel was counting, except she was counting every single hour since that Tuesday morning when she'd gone to wake him for school and found him unconscious on his bedroom floor. The paramedics had worked on him for 47 minutes. She'd counted those minutes too, watching them pump air into lungs that would never breathe on their own again, shocking a heart that would never beat again. Now, In the final round, with everything on the line, Steve was asking the question that would force Rachel to excavate the deepest part of her guilt and hold it up to the studio lights for everyone to see. "Rachel," Steve said gently, his voice stripped of game show energy and replaced with something that sounded more like a conversation between people who understood that some questions cut too deep for easy answers. "We need 43 points to win this thing. What's your biggest regret?" The studio buzzed with the familiar energy of a close game. The Davis family needed this answer to secure victory and take home $20,000 that could help with Tyler's medical bills. The ones that kept coming even though Tyler was gone. The final insult of a system that didn't understand that dead children don't need payment plans. This should have been manageable territory. Most people would say not spending enough time with loved ones, not taking chances, not saying "I love you" enough. Safe answers that revealed nothing too personal while still connecting with universal human experiences. But Rachel stood paralyzed at that podium, her mind not on survey responses or game strategy, but on the terrible arithmetic of that Tuesday morning. If she'd woken up 10 minutes earlier, if she'd checked on him before her shower, if she'd noticed the signs that everyone said were so obvious in retrospect, if, the cruelest word in the English language. "Rachel?" Steve prompted gently, abandoning his mark behind the podium and taking several steps closer to her. He could see the tears forming in her eyes, could sense that his question had touched something much more devastating than he'd intended. Rachel looked across the stage at her family lined up at their podium. Jennifer was watching with the careful attention of a sister who'd been monitoring Rachel's emotional weather for months, ready to step in if the storm became too much to weather alone. Mark stood with his steady presence, the kind of man who'd learned that sometimes love meant simply being close enough to catch someone if they fell. Chloe was trying not to cry, this 17-year-old girl who'd lost her best friend and watched her aunt disappear into grief. "Not saving my son," Rachel said, and her voice cracked on the word son, as if speaking Tyler's relationship to her out loud made his absence feel fresh, all over again. The studio fell into the kind of silence that goes beyond mere quiet. This was the profound hush that emerges when 300 strangers suddenly understand they're witnessing something sacred and terrible, something that transcends entertainment and touches the rawest edge of human experience. Steve's expression changed completely, his game show host demeanor evaporating to reveal something more human, more vulnerable. In 40 years of hosting everything from comedy shows to family programs, he'd heard thousands of answers to thousands of questions. But something about the way Rachel said "not saving my son" with such devastating self-condemnation, such crushing finality, cut through every professional defense he'd built around his emotions. "Tell me what happened," Steve said, his voice gentle and completely stripped of performance. The game could wait. The points could wait. This moment was about something infinitely more important than any prize they could offer. Rachel reached into the small black purse she'd carried to Tyler's funeral, the one she'd never been able to use since. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out a tissue, the same kind she'd used to wipe away 8 months of tears that never seemed to stop coming. Tyler was struggling, she said, her voice growing stronger as she settled into the terrible rhythm of a story she'd told to police officers, social workers, grief counselors, and anyone else who needed to understand how a healthy 16-year-old boy could be alive one morning and dead the next. He'd been experimenting with drugs, marijuana at first, then pills, then harder stuff. "I knew something was wrong, but I thought I could handle it. I thought I could save him myself." The audience was completely still, hanging on every word of a nightmare that no parent should ever have to live through. That Tuesday morning, he seemed okay at breakfast. Rachel continued, tears now streaming freely down her face. "Quiet, but Tyler was often quiet. I kissed him goodbye when he left for school, told him I loved him, reminded him about his curfew. Normal things. The last normal things I ever said to him." Steve found himself fighting back tears, completely absorbed in this glimpse into a mother's worst nightmare. "But Tyler didn't go to school that day," Rachel said, her voice beginning to break apart. He came back home after I left for work. He used the key under the flower pot, went to his room, and took something. Fentanyl, the coroner said. He probably thought it was something else. Kids don't know what they're taking anymore. Everything's contaminated. The cameras were capturing not just Rachel's words but the transformation happening on her face as she spoke, the way guilt was making room for grief, the way truth was temporarily stronger than shame. I found him when I came home for lunch, Rachel said, and the clinical precision of her words couldn't hide the devastation behind them. He was unconscious on his bedroom floor. I called 911, tried CPR, did everything they tell you to do, but it was too late. It had been too late for hours. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that would define not just this moment, but his understanding of what it meant to truly serve the people who trusted him with their stories. Steve Harvey had made people laugh for decades. He'd hosted thousands of shows, met tens of thousands of people, and prided himself on his ability to find light in dark places. But standing there, looking at a mother who was drowning in guilt over her child's death, he found himself in territory where humor had no place, and answers felt impossibly inadequate. "Rachel," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion and something that sounded almost like reverence. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. What happened to Tyler was not your fault." Rachel looked up at him with eyes that held 8 months of sleepless nights, 8 months of replaying every conversation, every warning sign, every moment when she might have done something different. "But I should have known," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have seen the signs. I should have checked on him that morning. I should have—" "Stop," Steve said firmly, kneeling down in front of her so they were eye level, abandoning every protocol and rule about maintaining professional distance. "Rachel, I need you to hear this. Addiction is a disease. It takes children from good parents, from loving families, from people who did everything right. You didn't kill your son. Addiction killed your son." The studio was electric with the kind of tension that comes from witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't a game show anymore. This was one human being trying to help another carry a burden that threatened to destroy her. "You loved Tyler," Steve continued, his voice carrying clearly through the studio. "You were a good mother. You are a good mother. The fact that you're standing here 8 months later, still breathing, still trying to live, that's not failure. That's strength. That's love. That's what Tyler would want from you." Without consulting producers, without following any script, Steve did something that no game show host had ever done. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone, right there on stage, in front of 300 people and millions of viewers. "I want you to do something for me," Steve said, holding out his phone to Rachel. "I want you to call Tyler, right now." Rachel looked at him in confusion. "Steve, Tyler's gone, he's dead." "I know," Steve said gently. "But his voicemail is still there, isn't it? His voice is still there. I want you to call him and tell him what you need to tell him." The cameras caught the moment of recognition on Rachel's face, the understanding that Steve was offering her something she'd been too afraid to do for 8 months. With shaking hands, she took his phone and dialed Tyler's number, the same number she'd called 100 times since his death, just to hear his voice on the voicemail greeting. The studio fell completely silent, as Tyler's voice filled the space through the phone's speaker. "Hey, you've reached Tyler. I'm probably gaming or sleeping, so leave a message, and I'll get back to you. Maybe." Rachel closed her eyes, listening to her son's voice for the first time in months. When the beep sounded, she spoke through her tears. "Tyler, baby, it's Mom. I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I didn't see how much you were hurting. I'm sorry I failed you. But mostly, I need you to know that I love you. I love you so much, it feels like dying. And I'm going to try to forgive myself, because I think that's what you'd want. I think you'd want your mom to live, not just survive. I love you, Tyler. I love you forever." When she hung up, the studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the typical game show celebration. This was recognition of courage, of a mother taking the first step toward healing from wounds that might never fully close. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that what had just happened would ripple out far beyond this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, "Rachel just did something that takes more courage than any of us can imagine. She chose to love louder than her guilt. She chose to honor her son's memory by trying to heal instead of just surviving." He turned back to Rachel, taking her hands with the same gentleness he might show his own daughter. "Rachel, I want you to know something. Tyler didn't die because you were a bad mother. Tyler died because addiction is a predator that hunts children. You couldn't have saved him from that any more than you could have saved him from cancer or a car accident." As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something extraordinary continued to unfold. Parents approached Rachel not with pity, but with their own stories of children lost to addiction, to suicide, to accidents that left families shattered and searching for someone to blame. The common thread in every story was guilt, the terrible gnawing guilt that comes from being unable to protect the people we love most. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came from a woman in her 50s who approached Rachel with tears in her eyes. "My daughter died from an overdose 3 years ago," the woman said quietly. "I've been carrying the same guilt you are. Listening to you tonight, watching you choose to forgive yourself. That's the first time I've considered that maybe I could try to do the same." Rachel hugged this stranger tightly, understanding that grief had a way of creating instant family among people who understood loss at its deepest level. 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened, with extensive resources for addiction support and grief counseling. The response was unlike anything in game show history. Thousands of parents reached out to share their own stories of losing children to addiction, and many credited Rachel's courage with helping them take their first steps toward healing. Rachel's moment sparked a national conversation about addiction, about the guilt parents carry when they lose children to diseases they couldn't cure, about the importance of forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, in the grieving process. Steve's foundation partnered with addiction recovery organizations and grief counseling groups across the country to create programs specifically designed to help families navigate the complex emotions that come with losing someone to overdose. But the most important change happened in Rachel's own life. She started attending support groups for parents who'd lost children to addiction. She learned that guilt was a normal part of grief, but it didn't have to be permanent. She discovered that loving Tyler's memory didn't require punishing herself for his death. Rachel still calls Tyler's voicemail sometimes, usually on the anniversary of his death, or when the guilt threatens to overwhelm her again. But now, she also volunteers at a local addiction recovery center, sharing her story with other parents who are watching their children struggle with substances, helping them understand that love isn't always enough to save someone from addiction, but it's always enough to honor their memory. The question that shattered Rachel's heart, "What's your biggest regret?" became the question that started her healing, because sometimes the most devastating truths are also the most liberating ones. And sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to choose to truly live. The overdose mother's guilt wasn't a burden Rachel had to carry forever. It was a weight she could choose to set down, one day at a time, one breath at a time, one act of self-forgiveness at a time. Because Tyler wouldn't want his mother to die with him. He'd want her to live for both of them. And 8 months after the worst day of her life, Rachel finally understood the difference.